Imagine for a second being one of the most famous people on Earth. Not just like, hey, haven't I seen that guy in some show back in 2006? I'm talking like famous, where people hang on your every word, they study your lyrics like ancient scrolls, and start acting like you might have the secret answer to life, peace, the universe, and possibly why their lava lamp stopped working. And I'll admit, I'm guilty of this. The Beatles were hugely influential on me. When I was just getting into music at a young age, I dissected their lyrics to no end. And look at me now, I'm still talking about them here on YouTube. But by the late 1960s, John Lennon was not just a musician. To millions of people, he was still a Beatle. And that came with a strange kind of worship. To some fans, the Beatles weren't just a band. They were prophets in matching suits, four charming lads who had somehow been elected by the universe to explain youth, love, rebellion, and, well, haircuts. But according to Lennon, behind the scenes, it felt much less like a dream and much more like being trapped inside a golden machine. A machine that was powered by pressure, business fights, emotional exhaustion, chemical escape, and enough ego to light up London for a week. So in December of 1970, when the Beatles' breakup was still fresh, Lennon sat down with Rolling Stones founder John Lennon and did something shocking. He did not give a polite little "thanks for the memories" interview. He did not smile warmly and say, well, we simply grew apart. No, that would have been way too easy, and apparently far too healthy, because instead Lennon gave one of the rawest interviews of his life. He tore apart the biggest myth in rock history. He did not just talk about the end of the Beatles, he tried to explain why, in his mind, the Beatles had to end. He declared, "The dream is over." And when Lennon said that, he was not just talking about the band. He was talking about the 60s, the mythology, the worship, the business, the fans, the press, the whole shiny fantasy that had been wrapped around four exhausted musicians from Liverpool. So this is the story of John Lennon's version of the Beatles' collapse. The story of the myth he helped create. The resentment that built behind it, the business war that made everything worse, the personal wounds that never really healed, and the reason Lennon finally decided he was done being John Beatle. By late 1970, the Beatles were publicly finished. The dream band of the 1960s had become a legal, emotional, and financial mess. Not exactly the fun part of the movie. John Lennon had recently gone through 4 intense months of primal therapy with Arthur Janov. It was a painful psychological process built around confronting deep emotional wounds, especially childhood pain and fear. Lennon said the therapy helped him stop blocking his feelings and start actually feeling them, which does sound healthy. It also sounds like the absolute worst possible time to sit down for a major interview about your old band, your old friends, your marriage, your business disasters, your childhood, your anger, and the meaning of God. But that is exactly what happened. Lennon poured that emotional rawness into his first proper solo album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band. He believed it was the best thing he had ever done because to him, it was finally honest. There were no psychedelic riddles, no colorful dream postcards or newspaper taxis, no magical mystery fog machine politely covering the pain. Just stark and brutal reality. There were songs about his mother, songs about fear, songs about isolation, songs about everything he no longer believed in. And then came the interview. In this newly exposed state, Lennon sat across from John Lennon and spoke like a man who had absolutely no interest in protecting the brand anymore. The Beatles brand had been one of the most carefully polished images in popular culture. 4 lovable boys, cheeky lads, charming mop-tops who smiled, waved, bowed, and conquered the world. But Lennon was not interested in that version anymore. He wanted to tear away the glossy PR paint and show what, according to him, had really been underneath. And once Lennon started talking, he did not gently loosen the lid. He took a hammer to the whole jar. The world saw the Beatles as clean-cut, lovable boys. John Lennon saw something much uglier behind the curtain. In the interview, Lennon said the band had not been innocent little angels floating through Beatlemania on clouds of charm and good manners. In his telling, making it to the very top required toughness, ego, and a certain amount of ruthlessness. He said the Beatles had been the biggest bad boys around. That is the friendly version of his quote. The original had a little more bite. Let's just say it would not work great embroidered on a throw pillow. Behind closed doors, Lennon described Beatlemania as chaotic, decadent, and deeply unhealthy. He compared their tours to a modern version of ancient Roman excess, which is quite a sentence to take in. Most bands compare touring to summer camp or the circus, but there goes Lennon straight to the collapsing empire. And according to him, the clean image was partly a fantasy maintained by managers, the press, police, politicians, and a whole machine that had every reason to keep the money train moving. Because obviously the Beatles weren't just a band, they were an industry to so many people, a very profitable, very noisy, and very handsome industry. Lennon claimed that the reality of touring involved adult chaos, substances, constant temptation, and people protecting the image at all costs. He remembered moments where scandal was simply swept out of sight because the myth was too valuable to damage. The Beatles were the lovable lads in public. But according to Lennon, behind the scenes, they were treated almost like modern emperors, and the whole thing got stranger the bigger they became. The pressure was enormous. Lennon said he had been relying on pills and alcohol going back to his teenage years, playing long, brutal sets in Hamburg. By the time Beatlemania exploded, the machine only got more intense. The schedule was punishing, the attention was inhuman, and the crowds were overwhelming. And everywhere they went, they were expected to perform not just songs, but their role. Smile here, wave there, meet this mayor, shake this hand, kiss this baby, pretend this is normal. But it was not normal. According to Lennon, local officials would sometimes pressure the Beatles into meeting people, and if the band resisted, there could be threats of bad publicity. Because of course nothing says youth revolution quite like a mayor using his kids as a networking opportunity. Even worse, Lennon remembered being placed in emotionally impossible situations with sick or disabled fans. People would be pushed toward the band as if the Beatles had some kind of magical power to heal them. The public saw screaming girls and catchy songs, but Lennon remembered embarrassment, helplessness, and a horrible feeling that people expected them to be something more than human, like saints or miracle workers or very skinny wizards with guitars. And Lennon hated it. He said the band coped by becoming hard, sarcastic, and cruel in private, not because they were naturally heartless, but because the whole situation was so unreal, the dark humor became a survival tool. When the world insists you're a god, eventually you either believe it or start making jokes just to keep from losing your mind. Lennon also talked about years of psychedelic experimentation. He said he used those experiences to break down his ego. But even that eventually became part of a bigger pattern. The fame had created a false self. The therapy was trying to strip it away. His solo album was trying to strip it away. And the Rolling Stone interview was Lennon taking a flamethrower to the rest of it. The beginning of the end, in Lennon's view, came in 1967 when Beatles manager Brian Epstein died. Lennon said that after Brian died, the group just collapsed. Epstein had been the manager, the handler, the adult in the room, the person who understood how to keep the Beatles moving as a unit. So once he was gone, that balance completely changed. According to Lennon, Paul McCartney stepped forward and tried to keep the band going. Paul pushed them into new projects. And Paul tried to organize, and Paul tried to lead. And Lennon resented it all, not necessarily because Paul was doing nothing useful, but because, in Lennon's telling, the Beatles began just going in circles. The band no longer felt like four equal parts of one strange machine. Lennon felt that he and George Harrison were becoming sidemen in Paul's projects, and that bitterness came to a head during the Let It Be period. The Let It Be sessions were supposed to be returned to basics. The Beatles would get back to playing live together. No studio tricks, no elaborate production, just the band, some songs, some amps and cameras. Fortunately, the cameras captured a band that looked less like four joyful brothers rediscovering rock and roll and more like four men, just tired, waiting for someone else to say, "Maybe we should go home now." Lennon said he was checked out during those sessions. Paul wanted rehearsal and polish, but Lennon didn't have much patience for it. They had already been playing together since they were young men. They had lived through Hamburg, Beatlemania, the screaming, the fame, the drugs, gurus, the business meetings, the films, the lawsuits, and the whole hair evolution. And now here they were, sitting in a cold studio, being filmed while trying to act like this was a fresh new beginning. Because it was not. It was a breakup with microphones recording it. When Lennon watched the Let It Be film, he felt sick to his stomach. He believed the film was set up to make Paul look like the center of everything, while the others appeared to be lying around uselessly. In Lennon's words, it made Paul look like God, which, considering the Beatles had spent years trying to stop people from treating them like gods, must have been a fun little plot twist. Lennon even said he initially wanted the rough Let It Be tapes released because he thought they would break the myth. He wanted the public to see how fractured the Beatles really were. Not the fairy tale version anymore, not the smiling album cover, not the press release version, the real version, or at least the version Lennon believed was real. And at the same time, another war was happening, a business war. And if you thought the band drama was ugly, just wait until lawyers enter. The Beatles company, Apple, had become a financial disaster. And according to Lennon, the group was losing huge amounts of money. He believed people around them were taking advantage of the situation, living well while the band's finances slid into chaos. So Lennon backed Alan Klein, a tough New York businessman with a reputation for being aggressive, sharp, and not exactly the human version of a scented candle. Lennon trusted Klein because Klein knew his music. He understood the Beatles' internal dynamic and seemed like someone who could actually fight for them. But Paul McCartney just did not agree. Paul wanted Lee Eastman, his new father-in-law, involved in the band's affairs. And that created a brutal split. So on one side was John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Alan Klein. On the other, just Paul McCartney and the Eastmans. And from Lennon's perspective, the Eastman side felt condescending and elitist. He remembered Lee Eastman speaking down to him and insulting Klein in meetings, and Lennon took it personally. He saw it not just as a business disagreement, but as a class issue. He did not want to be controlled by someone he felt looked down on him. The more Lennon backed Klein, the more Paul dug in. Eventually, Lennon said Paul started telling the others to speak to his lawyer, which is always a great sign for a friendship. Nothing says, "We're still brothers," like, "Please direct all future emotional wounds to my legal representative." And of course, there was also Yoko. For Lennon, Yoko Ono was not just his wife. She was his artistic partner and his emotional partner, the person who, in his mind, helped him see beyond the Beatles. He saw her as brilliant, challenging, and creatively fearless. But according to Lennon, the Beatles' inner circle did not welcome her. He said they despised her from the very beginning. He remembered insults, coldness, and judgment. He specifically claimed that George Harrison insulted Yoko directly in the Apple office, saying she gave off bad vibes. And Lennon never forgot it. To him, this was not just a case of bandmates being awkward around a new girlfriend. It was a complete betrayal. He had brought the person he loved into the most important creative circle in his life, and he felt she was just rejected. He said Yoko sat through dozens of Beatles sessions in a cold, hostile environment, judged by people who did not want her there. Now, to be fair, this is Lennon's version. Other people have told the Beatles story very differently. But in December 1970, Lennon was not interested in polite balance. Keep in mind that this is him talking in this interview. He was interested in saying exactly how it felt to him. And to him, Yoko's rejection became one of the clearest signs that he had to choose. He later described it as being married to the Beatles or being married to Yoko. So of course he chose Yoko, which, depending on who you ask, either destroyed the Beatles, saved John Lennon, or simply revealed a breakup that was already well underway. But the boring answer is probably the most accurate. Because the Beatles were already cracking. Yoko did not invent the cracks. She just arrived in a time to be blamed for them. Very convenient, really. Nothing wraps up years of financial chaos, artistic resentment, fame trauma, management collapse, and four enormous egos like saying, it was all because of the girl sitting in the corner of the studio. Lennon finally made his decision in 1969. And the timeline here is very important. People often imagine that it's all so simple. Lennon turns to Paul before Toronto and says, "Hey, the group's over and I'm leaving." But according to Lennon's own account, it's not quite how it happened. Before and around the Toronto trip, Lennon told Alan Klein, Eric Clapton, and Klaus Voormann that he was leaving the Beatles. He was already thinking about a new musical future, maybe even something that had Clapton and Klaus in it. Maybe anything that was not the Beatles. Then after he returned, Lennon said there was a meeting with Paul. Paul was talking about the Beatles doing more Beatles things, and Lennon kept saying no. Eventually Paul asked what he meant, and Lennon told him, well, the group was over. he was leaving. But there's a twist because Alan Klein urged John not to make the breakup public right away. There were still a lot of business reasons to keep it quiet. Deals were still being worked out. The Beatles machine still had paperwork to chew through after all, because even when a dream dies, apparently it still needs a filing cabinet. According to Lennon, Paul was pleased that John was not going to make a public event of the leaving. But months later, Paul released his first solo album, and with it, publicly signaled that he was done with the Beatles. Lennon saw that as a brilliant PR move, though. He said he cursed himself for not doing it first. And you may think that John would be furious at Paul, but in the interview, Lennon actually said he was not angry. He was just hurt and frustrated, and he kind of felt outplayed. He believed Paul had used the breakup announcement in a way Lennon could have used himself. And he clearly hated that, because by then, the Beatles were not just a band breaking up, they were four men fighting over who got to control the ending. Who left first? Who betrayed whom? Who was the real leader? Who was the victim? Who got the headline? Who got the clean version? By 1970, even the breakup had become a competition, which is very Beatles. They could not even collapse without accidentally inventing a new format. So when John sat down for this 1970 Rolling Stone interview, it wasn't just a man complaining about his old band. It was an act of demolition. He was trying to dismantle the version of John Lennon that the world had built for him. He did not want to be a Beatle god. He did not want to be a spokesman for a generation, at least not the one that he was told to be. He did not want people treating him like a guru, a prophet, a therapist, a peace machine, or a walking fortune cookie with sideburns. He wanted to be John Lennon, not John Beatle, and that's why a certain song mattered so much to him. And that song was called God. And in that song, he listed the things he no longer believed in: magic, myths, heroes, and finally, Beatles. For Lennon, the Beatles had become one more myth that had to be rejected. He was not saying the music meant nothing. He was saying the mythology had become unbearable. The dream was over. Not just the Beatles' dream, the generational dream. The idea that the 60s had permanently changed everything. The idea that youth culture had defeated the establishment. The idea that love, hair, guitars, and a few very confident scarves had somehow fixed the world. By 1970, John Lennon did not believe that anymore. He looked around and saw the same class system, the same power structures, the same business games, and the same people in control. The revolution had produced a lot of posters, but the same old machine was still running. And Lennon was sick of being one of its most profitable decorations. And then he started to turn his fire on his peers. He mocked Mick Jagger and suggested the Rolling Stones had copied the Beatles more than people wanted to admit. He criticized Bob Dylan, rejecting the myth of Dylan and pointedly calling him Zimmerman. And this was not Lennon being calm, measured, or diplomatic. This was Lennon in full scorched earth mode. If rock stars had Yelp reviews, Lennon was leaving 1 star and just a 1 or 2 sentence review. But underneath all the sarcasm and anger, there was a serious point. Lennon wanted to strip away illusion, the illusion of the Beatles, and the illusion of fame and of the 60s and being worshipped, and the illusion that being worshipped feels good, the illusion that success automatically heals anything. Because to Lennon, he had discovered the complete opposite. Success had not healed him. Fame had not made him free. The Beatles had not saved him from pain. If anything, the myth had trapped him inside a version of himself that no longer felt real. This is why his solo album sounded so bare. This is why the interview sounded so brutal. This is why he kept returning to simple rock and roll music. No grand production, no psychedelic smoke anymore, no costumes or gurus, just his voice, his guitar, his piano, bringing all his pain to the front and trying to expose reality. For Lennon, that was freedom, or at least it was the beginning of freedom. The Beatles had been the biggest band in the world, but by 1970, John Lennon no longer wanted to live inside the biggest band in the world. He wanted out of the costume. And if the world still needed the Beatles to be perfect, well, Lennon was there to smash the illusion. Honestly, he seemed almost excited to ruin it. Like a man finally saying, "You've all built a cathedral around 4 tired guys with the guitars, and I've showed up with my wrecking ball." John Lennon's 1970 Rolling Stone interview remains one of the most explosive moments in rock history, because it captured him at a rare and dangerous point. This is a time when he was feeling very wounded and angry, and he was newly raw from therapy, and he was still deeply in love with Yoko and very bitter toward Paul. He was furious at all of what the Beatles had become, and he was suspicious of fame, business, hippies, critics, fans, gurus, myths, and basically anything that looked too comfortable sitting on a pedestal. And he was just ready to talk about it. And the result was not a neat and balanced history of the Beatles, it was Lennon's emotional truth in that exact moment. It was messy and contradictory, it was funny and cruel, honest, unfair, brilliant and human. In other words, it was extremely John Lennon. He took the most beloved cultural myth of the 20th century and tried to tear it down, in public view. Not because the Beatles' music didn't matter anymore, but because to Lennon the myth had become a cage. He wanted to stop being a symbol and to start being a person. And that's what makes the interview so powerful, because the dream was over and John Lennon was done pretending otherwise. If you haven't read the article, I highly encourage that you do. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Make sure to subscribe and hit like and leave a comment. And thank you for watching.